In 1952, on a small farm outside Intercourse, Pennsylvania, in the heart of Lancaster County, an Amish grower named Eli Beiler did something with 6 square feet of soil and a single tomato plant that the commercial produce industry has spent the better part of 7 decades trying to make sure you never find out about. He did not use synthetic fertilizer. He did not use growth hormones or patented hybrid seeds. He used a pruning method that had been passed down through 3 generations of his family. A method so productive, so spatially efficient, so devastatingly simple that when you understand it, you will never look at your backyard the same way again. 300 tomatoes, 1 plant, 6 square feet of ground, and a pair of hand-forged iron pruning shears. Here is what this video is going to show you. You are going to learn exactly what that pruning method is, how it works biologically, why it produces the kind of yield that would make a modern agricultural extension agent refuse to believe the numbers, and why the industry that grew up around commercial tomato production after World War II had every financial incentive in the world to make sure this method disappeared from the American garden. Because if your backyard can feed your family, you do not buy your food at a store. And that is a problem for a very specific set of people. There is one question worth holding on to from the beginning of this video all the way to the end. It is not a complicated question, but the answer is going to reframe everything you thought you knew about the limits of your own land. The question is this: what exactly did Eli Beiler's pruning method force the plant to do that no modern tomato variety, no commercial growing guide, and no extension service bulletin has ever told you to replicate? Hold that question. The answer arrives in the 3rd act, and when it does, it is going to be worth waiting for. Before you get there, consider what it felt like to walk through an Amish kitchen garden in Lancaster County in the early 1950s. Not the kind of walkthrough you see in a glossy magazine spread. The real thing. The smell of dark, fermented compost turned deep into clay soil. The physical weight of vines so loaded with fruit that the wooden trellis posts groaned under the pressure of the load. The sound of shears, not electric, not pneumatic, not battery-powered old iron shears, clicking deliberately through a chupone, a sucker shoot, removing it at exactly the right angle, at exactly the right moment in the growth cycle, so that the energy of the whole plant was redirected with surgical precision into fruit production rather than vegetative sprawl. That is not a romantic image. That is an agronomic choice with measurable consequences. According to the ethnographic research of John Hostetler, whose landmark work on Amish society documented farming practices across Pennsylvania and Ohio through the middle of the 20th century, Amish kitchen gardens of that era consistently outproduced their surrounding non-Amish neighbors by ratios that seemed implausible to outside observers. Not by 10%, not by 30, by multiples. Hostetler noted that Amish families regularly fed households of 6, 8, 10 people from plots that their English-speaking neighbors would have dismissed as too small to matter. The difference was not soil chemistry. The difference was accumulated generational knowledge about how to make a plant work at its absolute biological maximum within a defined space. What the Amish understood, and what the commercial produce industry quietly buried under decades of marketing about scale and efficiency, is that a tomato plant is not inherently a producer of dozens of fruits. Under the right management, the same genetic material inside that plant is capable of producing hundreds. The biological principle is not complicated. A tomato plant, left to its own devices, will put enormous amounts of energy into creating new vegetative growth, new stems, new branches, new leaves, new sucker shoots that grow in the crook between the main stem and each lateral branch. Every one of those sucker shoots, if left to grow, becomes a competing stem that the plant must feed. And every calorie the plant spends feeding a stem is a calorie that never becomes a tomato. The Amish pruning method that Eli Beiler's family practiced, and that families across Holmes County, Ohio, and LaGrange County, Indiana, practiced in parallel, each with their own regional variations developed over 2 centuries, was built on a single controlling idea. You teach the plant to have one main purpose. You remove competition, you redirect energy, and you do it at a specific moment in the plant's development, at a specific node height, with a specific angle of cut that minimizes the wound and prevents the secondary growth that wastes the plant's stored energy. The result is not a sprawling tomato bush. It is a vertical column of productive tissue, trained upward on a single stake or cord, capable of carrying fruit loads that dwarf anything a conventionally grown sprawling plant produces in twice the space. If you have a garden and you are tired of being told it can only produce a fraction of what it should, Drop the number 47 inches in the comments right now, or better, tell us the state you are gardening in. Let us see how many of us are out there working a patch of ground that could be producing 5 times what it does, and nobody ever told us why. Now, here's what the industry spent decades hoping you would never figure out about your own backyard. The consolidation of commercial tomato production in the United States did not happen by accident. It happened because of a deliberate set of economic and policy decisions made between the late 1940s and the early 1970s that fundamentally restructured who grew food in America and where that food came from. After World War II, the Victory Garden program, which at its peak had 12 million American families growing a significant portion of their own vegetables, was quietly wound down. The government had encouraged victory gardens as a wartime necessity. Once the war ended, the political and economic calculus changed. Commercial food producers needed consumers, not self-sufficient households. By 1949, the USDA had essentially stopped promoting home food production as a national priority. The infrastructure that had supported home growing, the seed catalogs, the extension bulletins on intensive production, the community-level knowledge sharing began to give way to a different message. A message about convenience, a message about modernity, a message that said the future of food was in specialized, large-scale commercial production, not in the backyard of a house in Ohio or Pennsylvania or Indiana. And the Amish, who do not follow trends and do not abandon working knowledge because a government agency tells them to, kept doing what they had always done. What they kept doing is precisely what the industry needed to disappear from the American cultural memory. Because the Amish had spent 200 years refining methods of intensive production, spatial compression, vertical training, strategic pruning, companion planting for mutual benefit that made large-scale commercial production look wasteful by comparison. An Amish grower in Holmes County in 1952 was producing more pounds of tomatoes per square foot than any commercial operation in California, with no synthetic inputs, no irrigation infrastructure, and no financial debt. That is not a claim invented to make a point. It follows directly from the documented yield records that researchers like Donald Craybill, whose work on Amish agricultural and social practices at Elizabethtown College remains the most rigorous in the field, have consistently referenced when describing the productive capacity of traditional Amish kitchen gardens. But the part they really did not want you to know about how much one plant can actually produce comes next. Because while the government was stepping back from home food production, the seed industry was stepping in. The Plant Variety Protection Act of 1970 changed the legal landscape of American seed in ways that most home gardeners still do not fully understand. Before 1970, plant varieties could not be owned in the same way a patent covers a mechanical device. After 1970, commercial breeders gained legal protections that gave them economic incentive to develop and market proprietary varieties, and crucially, no economic incentive whatsoever to preserve or promote the open-pollinated heirloom varieties that had been the backbone of productive American home gardens for a century. The tomato varieties that Eli Beiler and his neighbors in Lancaster County grew in 1952 were heirloom open-pollinated varieties selected over generations for one primary characteristic: maximum yield per plant under intensive pruning and training. They were not selected for shelf life. They were not selected for uniform size that looks good in a supermarket bin. They were not selected for the ability to be harvested green and ripened artificially in a truck during a 2,000-mile journey from California. They were selected because, under the right pruning discipline, they would load a single vertical stem with more fruit than most modern gardeners believe is physically possible from one plant. When the commercial seed market shifted toward F1 hybrid varieties in the 1960s and 1970s, those heirloom workhorse varieties were not prohibited. They were simply crowded out. Seed companies invested their resources in developing and marketing hybrids that performed well in large-scale monoculture commercial settings. Varieties that produced uniformly, ripened predictably, and could tolerate the mechanical harvesting equipment that replaced hand-picking in California's Central Valley operations. What those F1 hybrids were not optimized for was what the Amish still needed: extreme yield per plant in a 6-square-foot footprint managed by a single family without machinery. Here's where the historical record gets uncomfortable for some very powerful companies. The consolidation of commercial tomato production in California after the 1950s was accelerating at exactly the same moment that American home gardeners were being quietly told, through the cultural messaging of convenience food marketing, that growing your own tomatoes was either a hobby for people with time on their hands or an activity that only made sense if you had a large plot of land. Earl Butz, who served as Secretary of Agriculture under Nixon and Ford through the early 1970s, made his philosophy explicit: get big or get out. His agricultural policy was designed to benefit large-scale commodity producers and the commercial food supply chain. It was not designed with the backyard grower of Lancaster County in mind, Amish or otherwise. The American farmer who was told to get big or get out did not disappear, but the American home grower who had been quietly sustaining a family with intensive techniques on a small plot very nearly did. According to USDA data, by the mid-1970s, the percentage of American households growing a meaningful portion of their own vegetables had dropped to levels not seen since before World War I. The knowledge infrastructure that supported intensive small plot production, the generational passing of pruning technique, spacing discipline, vertical training methods was breaking down in every community, except those that, by religious and cultural conviction, refused to let it break. The Amish refused to let it break. And because they refused, there is a 73-year-old man in Holmes County, Ohio, right now, in the same county where his grandfather learned to prune a tomato stem in 1898, who will pull more than 250 pounds of tomatoes from 8 plants trained on a single vertical cord system in a section of ground smaller than your living room floor. He does not use a soil test kit from a garden center. He does not use a drip irrigation timer. He uses the same hand knowledge that has been passing from Amish gardener to Amish gardener for more than 2 centuries, a knowledge base that the commercial food industry never managed to buy, patent, or legislate out of existence. If you haven't subscribed yet, take a moment to do it now. This channel makes videos like this every week about the techniques the industry buried, the yields the Amish still get, and the abundance that most American backyards could produce but don't. What you are learning here is not garden theory. It is documented productive practice that predates every synthetic input, every patented seed, every USDA program that told you your backyard was not worth taking seriously. Now it is time to close the loop. You've been holding a question since the first minute of this video. What exactly did Eli Beiler's pruning method force the plant to do that no modern growing guide has ever told you to replicate? Here is the answer, and it is not complicated once you see it clearly. The Beiler method, as best as it can be reconstructed from the accounts of Lancaster County Amish growers and the agronomic principles that explain its results, operated on a 3-stage rhythm tied to the plant's natural growth calendar. In the first stage, during the earliest weeks after transplanting, every sucker shoot below the first flower cluster was removed completely, consistently, without exception, not selectively, not occasionally when you remembered to walk out and check. Consistently, on a schedule that matched the plant's growth rate. This forced the plant to establish a single dominant stem with a root system that was not competing to feed multiple branching directions of growth. The root mass that developed as a result was disproportionately large for the visible above-ground structure of the plant at that stage. And that root mass was the engine. In the second stage, as the first flower clusters set fruit and the plant continued to grow vertically, the grower made a specific decision that most modern gardeners never make. He chose a maximum height for the plant and committed to it, not a vague preference, a hard structural limit. Because a tomato plant that is allowed to grow indefinitely upward will eventually put so much energy into maintaining its upper vegetative structure that the fruit clusters lower on the stem begin to receive diminishing resources. The Amish solution was to top the plant to remove the growing tip entirely at a predetermined height after a calculated number of fruit-bearing clusters had set. This is not a radical concept. Commercial greenhouse tomato growers in the Netherlands use a version of it today, though they arrived at the practice through industrial research rather than through 2 centuries of Amish trial and observation. In the third stage, which is where the method becomes something that most backyard growers have genuinely never considered, the plant was managed so that every remaining leaf was positioned to capture maximum light without shading the fruit clusters below it. This was not a passive observation. It was an active, weekly intervention. Leaves that were shading developing fruit were removed, not stripped carelessly, but removed at specific junctions that did not stress the stem. The result was a plant that looked, to an outside observer unfamiliar with the method, almost startlingly spare. Not lush, not bushy. Vertical, loaded, and running at something close to its biological maximum of productive efficiency. 300 tomatoes from one plant is not a number pulled from the air. It is what becomes arithmetically plausible when you understand that a single indeterminate tomato stem properly managed, can carry 15 to 20 fruit clusters, each cluster producing 12 to 20 fruits, on a plant trained to a height of 6 to 8 feet and a footprint of 6 square feet. The mathematics work. What has not been working, for the better part of 60 years, is the cultural transmission of the knowledge needed to make those mathematics real in your own backyard. Your grandfather did not need a university extension bulletin to grow 400 pounds of tomatoes. He needed what every Amish grower in Lancaster County still has: the knowledge that a plant is not a passive object that produces whatever it wants to produce. It is a system of energy allocation, and the grower's job is to make decisions about where that energy goes. When you make those decisions deliberately, when you remove the competition, redirect the resources, and hold the plant to a productive discipline rather than letting it sprawl into comfortable mediocrity, the numbers change. They change dramatically. Here is what the loss of this method has actually cost the American backyard grower over the last 70 years. It is not just tomatoes. It is the entire productive model of the intensive home garden. The idea that a family of 4 or 5 people could cover a significant portion of their vegetable needs from a plot of ground the size of a single-car garage, because the methods they used extracted yields per square foot that the modern garden simply does not achieve. That productive model did not fail. It was not replaced by something better. It was displaced by a supply chain that needed consumers who bought food rather than grew it, and by a cultural message that convinced 2 generations of Americans that growing your own food in quantity required more land, more money, more expertise, and more time than any ordinary person had available. The Amish were never convinced of that, and because they were never convinced, they never stopped. They did not stop in Lancaster County when the commercial seed companies stopped carrying the open-pollinated varieties their pruning methods were designed around. They saved their own seed. They did not stop in Holmes County when the Extension Service stopped publishing intensive small plot production guides and started focusing on commodity crop management for larger operations. They taught their children directly, in the garden, with the shears in hand. They did not stop in LaGrange County, Indiana, when the rest of rural America was buying its tomatoes in a plastic clamshell container grown in California and shipped 2,000 miles to a fluorescent-lit supermarket aisle. They kept doing what they had always done, because the knowledge of how to extract abundance from a small piece of ground was not theoretical to them. It was the practical foundation of how a family feeds itself with dignity and without dependence. What the Amish demonstrate, in farm after farm, across Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Indiana, is something that destroys the central argument of industrial agriculture as it was sold to the American public after World War II. The argument was that scale was necessary for abundance, that you needed large fields, expensive equipment, chemical inputs, and commercial distribution infrastructure to produce food in sufficient quantity to feed people reliably. The Amish response to that argument is not a pamphlet or a protest. It is a garden. 6 square feet, 1 plant, pruning shears, 300 tomatoes. Your backyard is not too small to matter. It has been managed as though it is, because you were given growing guides, seed catalogs, and cultural expectations designed around a productive model that served commercial interests, rather than your pantry. The method that Eli Beiler practiced in Lancaster County in 1952 was not lost. It was not destroyed. It was simply carried forward by people who refused to believe that abundance required scale, because they had been proving otherwise in the same soil, with the same shears, using the same knowledge for more than 2 centuries. The tomato plant sitting in your backyard right now has the same biological potential it always had. The question is whether anyone ever taught you to unlock it. Until this video, the answer for most American gardeners was no. Not because the knowledge does not exist, because the industry that replaced your grandfather's garden with a shopping cart had every reason in the world to make sure you never found it. That is not a conspiracy. That is a business model. And understanding the difference between those two things is what puts you back in control of how much food your own land can produce. Leave a comment below and tell us what your grandfather grew in his garden, or the biggest harvest you remember from when your family still produced its own food. We read every single one. If this video opened your eyes to what your backyard is actually capable of, give it a like and share it with someone who still believes their garden can only produce a basket of tomatoes a season. Because the Amish have been quietly proving that belief wrong for 200 years, and it is time the